Nicholas Mosley has achieved something dazzling, a book which is immensely clever and interesting on many different levels. The pace is fast, the characters are vivid, his mother's death unbearably sad. Much of this effect is created by his skill as a novelist, but Oswald and Cynthia Mosley live up to the demands of art. It is as a serene and sustained attempt by a son to understand a strange father that this book is chiefly remarkable. The work of a fine writer. A brilliant book. He has honored his father by not bending the facts and introducing to us a form of biography which can be truly looked on as a work of art. A notable work. A study of father-son relations, at least as fine as classics like Edmund Goss's Father and Son or Osbert Sitwell's autobiographies. It is also a book that paints a picture of a vanished society and of an enigmatic politician in whom intelligence and naivety, attractiveness and repulsiveness were strangely mixed. Nicholas Mosley's account of his father and mother is interspersed with reminiscences of his own childhood, sometimes poignant, often enchanting. He has the true creator's gift of being able to recapture the child's eye view. Although his portrait of his father is outspokenly frank, it is not at all vindictive or an expression of revenge. In fact, his dedicated search for the truth about this remarkable man is clearly a labor of love. Fascinating, compelling, and frank. This is a very fine book, not because it teaches us much about fascism or about one particular would-be fascist dictator, but because it shows a non-fascist mentality, Nicholas's, for once, honestly engaged in thinking profoundly about politics without being circumscribed and intellectually crippled by liberal assumptions which are never challenged. Nicholas Mosley's account is a devastatingly brilliant story in the unreliable tradition of Goss's Father and Son. Though written by a man of 60, this book has all the fresh awkwardness of adolescent agony. Nicholas Mosley completes an extraordinary feat, that of combining his recollections of his own childhood, adolescence, and early maturity with an account of his father, both as a private and public figure, without heroics, apologetics, or compromise with the truth as he now sees it. A remarkable book. And what book would that be? Rules of the Game / Beyond the Pale by Nicholas Mosley. I think this might be my favorite book now. And that's not to say that it's a perfect book, but it might be my favorite book I've yet read. I've been on this trip to Washington, and I've had a lot of downtime. And so I've been reading a lot, and specifically this book I've been reading, and I was able to finish it yesterday, or the day before possibly. And this is an amazing book. I mean, I think it's lucky that we have this book, because it's an invaluable insight into Oswald Mosley from the perspective of his son, Nicholas Mosley. And Oswald Mosley is, of course, you know, before I even read this book, I thought he was one of the most amazing figures in history, one of the most interesting people I'd ever read about. And so, imagine my excitement when I find out that there's a book written by his son about him. That's the kind of insight that I wish I had about Napoleon. I wish that Napoleon had a son who wrote a book about Napoleon. I mean, let me read a little bit of the blurb. It says, once known as the most hated man in England, Sir Oswald Mosley, 1896 to 1980, is an intriguing and infamous figure in British politics. The most hated man in England. It takes a lot, I think, to kind of give an accurate portrayal of Oswald Mosley when he's known as the most hated man in England. You know, that's not something you overcome easily. It takes a certain amount of poise and a certain amount of earnestness and desire for a truthful account. And I don't think anyone could pull it off quite the way Nicholas did, because Nicholas has such a personal story to tell, as well as a biography. It's also a bit of an autobiography. This book is a memoir. It says Memoirs of Sir Oswald Mosley and Family. It's a memoir of Nicholas's life in relation to his father, who he calls Tom in this book. Or he really only calls him Tom during the first, because it's 2 books. It's Rules of the Game is the first book, and that's about Tom's life from birth to the founding of the British Union of Fascists. And he calls him Tom a lot in that book. But then for some reason in the second book, in Beyond the Pale, which is about Tom's experience with fascism and a little bit about his life after fascism, in Beyond the Pale, he doesn't really call him Tom very much. He calls him, oh, there's a very thorny bush here. He calls him my father or Mosley. Tom is the name that people called him familiarly. But for some reason he decides to only really make heavy use of it in that first book. I don't know why. Yeah, there's also a fair amount about his mother, Nicholas's mother, Cynthia Mosley, who went by Simmy. Cynthia Curzon originally, and she was the daughter of the Viceroy of India. I don't think that Oswald Mosley deserves the amount of hate that he gets. Even to this day, he still gets a lot of hate. Now, he deserves some of it, for sure. But there's another part of this blurb that I kind of liked, too, where, yeah, it says, although head of the British Fascist Party in the 1930s, he was no common demagogue. His life resembles a politicized Brideshead Revisited, and his political outlook had more in common with Goethe and Nietzsche than with Hitler and Mussolini. That's an interesting description. Because, you know, there's a lot of stereotypes associated with fascism. And, you know, many of these stereotypes I think Mosley conformed to for one reason or another, whatever, for whatever reason he was compelled by them. But other stereotypes, not so much. For instance, there is a myth, I think, that the British fascist movement was kind of a thuggish, bullyish movement. A violent movement. And, well, the thing about that is, in this book, Nicholas points out a few isolated, or not so isolated, but a few, I would say uncommon cases of that sort of thuggishness, that sort of brutality on the part of the BUF, on the part of the black shirts specifically, the young youth movement. But really, the vast, vast, vast majority of the violence associated with the BUF was perpetrated on the BUF, on the black shirts, by communists and, to be frank, by Jews. And that's a big reason why Oswald Mosley became anti-Semitic. Because even before he was the leader of a fascist party, an explicitly fascist party, when he was in the New Party, he was getting attacked by communists because he was taking votes away from the Labour Party, which I don't know why communists would even really care so much about electoralism. They're more, they're a little bit more pessimistic usually about that sort of thing. But, you know, England is a different sort of country. But then, you know, when he became more explicitly identified with fascism, he started getting attacked by Jews as well. When he didn't actually initiate any kind of attack on the Jewry, and he had no interest in attacking Jews at first. But then the Jewry started attacking him, and it's because of obviously, you know, his association with fascism is going to do that, and that's something that he should have been able to predict. And that's one of the, you know, the criticisms that Nicholas brings up in this book, a really important criticism of Oswald Mosley, is that, you know, he did all this stuff. He went into this radical kind of political group, the fascists, and they already had so much baggage associated with them. They already had so much anti-Semitism and racialism associated with them. And so what was he thinking was going to happen? You know, he brought all of this on himself by doing what he did. And so it's like, you look at it and you think, well, you know, I don't really like when people initiate violence or escalate tensions through violence or otherwise. I don't think that's ever a good idea. And so I think, you know, I blame the left, I think, and the Jewry, who attacked him specifically, those ones. Although not all of them were against him at first. But I blame them more than I would blame the BUF just for the violence of it, because they were the ones who were actually perpetrating the violence. The black shirts, the whole point of them, and the whole point of the youth movement in the New Party, the NUPA youth, that came before the black shirts, was to defend the meetings because they were getting attacked and Mosley couldn't have his voice heard by the people who wanted to listen to him, which is silly. There's no reason you need to be doing that to people, even though, you know, they have, I think the left and Antifa, they always have this idea that they need to suppress what they call fascism. In that specific case, it actually was fascism, but they have this idea that they need to suppress this thing that in their minds they think of as fascism, and they have all these ideas associated with it. They have a whole story they tell themselves, a whole kind of dismal outlook on it. and they need to suppress it with violence lest it suppresses them with violence. That's always what they say. And at the time, I can understand where they're coming from at the time. Not so much today. I think today they need to calm the fuck down. But I think, in the 1930s, it totally makes sense why they would have it in their heads that this is the only option for them. That they need to use violence to attack these meetings to prevent this voice from being heard. But I still disagree with it. And I still think that they caused this violence. That wouldn't have happened without them. And I also, furthermore, think in this case, they didn't quite understand British fascism. In this specific case, I think that if they had really done their research and tried to understand what Mosley was about, they would know that British fascism was in no danger of creating the kind of situation that they had in Italy. Because it was a different political culture and specifically a different political leader. And, just as German National Socialism became defined pretty much exclusively by Hitler's interests and what Hitler wanted, British National Socialism was the same. It was basically just Mosley's platform to spread his ideas and specifically his economic vision, but also his social vision, his idea for wanting a kind of reinvented, reimagined British society, focused on youth and energy and action and vigor and vitality. But key among these qualities was that Mosley was very explicit all the way through that he didn't want to do the kind of thing that Mussolini did. He didn't want to pressure the king into making him a dictator. He wanted the British public to vote for fascism. And I actually believe him in this, because I read this whole book, and I think I understand this guy's political philosophy pretty well. I don't think that was ever a ruse on Mosley's part. I think that he was always very serious about that. Because Mosley was a man of contradictions. And this is a really interesting thing that his son brings up. That he always was able to kind of have it both ways. And I say able because he felt himself able to have it both ways. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was able to be successful and have it both ways. Because he ultimately, his political career was a failure. He had the most success when he was young, when he was just starting out, when he was working in the established political machine, when he was working in the Conservative Party and then in the Labour Party. But even, I would say even then, I think he didn't feel himself a success because he couldn't actually put through any of his plans or his ideas, and he couldn't actually do anything efficacious in the government, which is why he wanted to change the whole machine of government to be more efficacious. And I think that was a noble goal. And I don't think that Mosley's idea of the fascist state was really a bad idea. In essence, I think that there were some weird aspects of it. I think that, with the arrival of people like William Joyce and the other guy, can't remember his name, Beckett, there was and with the attacks coming against him from Jewish people, there was a strange sort of anti-Semitism and racialism that started to creep into the British Union of Fascists, which Mosley was a fan of, but he would then try to distance himself from it at the same time. Like I said, he always wanted to have it both ways. And so that, you know, that's I think the one thing that would make me kind of not want to vote for them. Because it's just so weird and unnecessary. It always kind of, I think it feels very, like, bizarrely identitarian for a movement that really prided itself in reason and rationality. Which is strange for a fascist movement, because as I said in my video about why I admire fascism, I said that fascism is not really concerned so much with rationality and reason, and values feeling a little bit more. And Mosley, again, he's a man of contradictions, because he said, he said, I want to move away from being a party of people who think, and I want a party of people who can feel. But then at the same time, his whole program is based on thinking. It's all based on logic and rationality and reason. Revolution by reason. That was his whole gimmick. And he kept to that. And so it's just weird how his movement was so based on thought, you know, the thought, deed, man, reason and whatnot, math, and then there's this identitarian thing that creeps in, and I dislike identitarianism in all of its forms. And it's always been the big sticking point that makes me kind of dislike fascism. Because it just seems like you have really at the kernel of fascism a really interesting, really valuable insight into humanity and psychology and government, and a really kind of, well, it's a very, you know, very yang focused, like yin and yang. It's very much on the yang side of things, and so it doesn't quite have a lot of balance to it. But even so, I think it understands the yang very well, and it's very eager to take advantage of the yang in a way that I think is very helpful and very you know, very positive in a lot of ways. And so, you know, I find myself really sympathizing a lot with Mosley's vision. But then it's just, you know, the identitarian shit always just comes in and ruins the party for me. And there's a chapter in this book that's particularly hard to read. Let me see if I can find it. I mean, the chapter on William Joyce ain't a picnic either. Because, you know, William Joyce was very anti-Semitic, and he was kind of picked as being the second in line in the party before he was fired in '36. The Party, I think, is what it's called. Yeah, that chapter is rough because, you know, if Mosley weren't in charge of the movement he created would have just been a total shit show. It would have just been the stereotype, the fascist stereotype. And that's something that I don't know why Mosley either didn't see that or ignored it or didn't think it was important. It's like he thought that he was spearheading this really great thing, but it was just him. It was just him who was the great thing. The thing he was spearheading was shit. It wasn't a good party. He was a good politician. That was the issue, I think, with the BUF. He had all these wonderful ideas, but I don't know how much anyone else like William Joyce really understood them. Because William Joyce would just get on stage and rant about the Jews all the time, which is not the kind of image he wanted to cultivate, Mosley wanted to cultivate. But at the same time, he did nothing to stop that. There's a part, and it's frustrating, and it was frustrating to Nicholas, and he writes about this, just getting sick and tired the more he watched his dad and watched the way he conducted politics, getting sick of his just always turning a blind eye to this stuff that he claimed he wasn't turning a blind eye to, that he claimed that he was not okay with. But there's a part, you know, there's a part in this book where he describes that, of somebody, I think it was in the union movement days later on in the late 40s, where Mosley had this party that was supposed to be about a united Europe. Again, here's the contradiction of fascism, unity and identitarianism, which is a contradiction that I don't think was ever reconciled in a way that I admire, because it was all just it was like they thought that you could only achieve unity through identitarianism, which I don't agree with. But there was a guy who was putting out these racist pamphlets, and Mosley brought him into his office and reprimanded him severely for that, because it's not the kind of image that he wanted to project with union movement. But then, and Nicholas saw this, as they were walking out of the door, he gave him sort of a little wink and a pat on the back. And the way Nicholas interpreted this is like, this reprimanding is the thing I have to do because I have to do it, because it's expected of me in the position that I'm in the kind of image that I'm trying to market for this party. But I really don't care. I really don't give a shit if you want to be racist, and you can do it all you want. But the thing is, I don't think Mosley was all that racist as a person, which is just so weird, because, you know, there's a part in this book where the groundskeeper at, I think, Wooten House, or one of Mosley's cottages, one of his mansions, the groundskeeper was black, and the groundskeeper said that Mosley was the only boss he ever had who didn't seem to even notice him being black. He didn't seem to even notice his race. He just treated him as like a white man. Which, you know, for a guy who has this reputation of being the British Hitler, that's surprising that of all the bosses this black groundskeeper had, it would be Mosley who he had the best opinion of, who was the least racist. But that's just the essential contradiction. It was like Mosley was aesthetically and superficially racist, whereas in reality, in his real opinion and his real attitude about race, he wasn't very racist at all. Whereas a lot of people around him, like, you know, Winston Churchill, and I made that whole video about Winston Churchill, where I used clips from Cam and Ray's Cold War podcast. That dude was severely racist on a very personal level, in a way that Mosley wasn't. But then he has this reputation of being the man who fought Hitler, who fought racism, when he was way more racist, I think, on a personal level than Oswald Mosley, who has the reputation of being the British Hitler. It's all backwards. But the thing is that Mosley created that situation. It's Mosley's fault that it's backwards. Because everything that Mosley did in his career, it was like he just didn't care about the PR of it. He didn't care about being perceived as a racist. And I, for the life of me, I can't understand why he thought that was a good idea. And he was always partnering with the most racist people in Britain, and then later on, the most racist people in all of Europe, ex-Nazis and whatnot. He was always partnering with them, working with them, with apartheid people in South Africa, with all those guys. He loved those guys. But it's so strange, and I think it really gets down to what Nicholas says about his father, that I think is the most intelligent, or the most important, I would say, insight into this guy, is that he perceived human beings as being fundamentally rational. That if you explained something to a person and explained the reasoning of it, explained why it makes sense, that they would get with the program and they would do it, and they would support it. All you had to do was explain to people why it made sense. And Nicholas Mosley looks at that and he says that, you know, that's not really how human beings are. There's a lot more to a human being than just rationality and reason. And the irony of that is that that's the insight that fascism had, that there is a lot more to the human being than rationality and reason. And that's the insight that Mosley should have picked up on, and indeed did pick up on in certain respects. But it seems like it never quite clicked with him. That all of that you can't have it both ways. And he kept wanting to have it both ways. He kept wanting for all of his best friends to be racist, for his whole party to be racist, and also to not be perceived as a racist movement. Because he personally himself wasn't all that racist. Even though he had all this, he had this kind of racist program in mind, like in Union Movement, he wanted a different kind of apartheid in Africa, where black people would have their own countries and white people would have their own countries, and they would all move. And of course you look at that and you think, well, that would be a serious undertaking, a huge, just impossible thing to expect that people are all gonna lift up their lives and move to a different country so that they can have this, you know, what's really kind of an irrational separation between black and white. There's no way it would really work in that clean way, but Mosley was convinced that if you just explain to people why they need to do it, then they'll understand and they'll do it and they'll be happy to do it. And it's just like, you know, I find myself, you know, reading about his ideas, even in regards to that, which, you know, I'm not a big fan of racial segregation, but he had good points. He had good reasons for wanting it. He had good, like his ideas made sense in that regard. That the black people and the white people need to be separate. They need to have different governments just because they don't get along, and they're so different from each other, and they're at such different levels in their development, that it just makes more sense to separate them out and give them each their own countries. And he even wanted to lend white support to the black people and like help them build up their institutions, help them build up their industries so that, you know, they could survive on their own okay. He had all these very rational ideas for how to plan all this out. But it's just like, it was always such a pipe dream, and I think he was a big dreamer, and he loved these big grand ideas about how you could use rational planning to reorganize society in a way that would be beneficial. And you read these ideas and they're great ideas. And that's what makes him so compelling, is that he was right, I think. With most of the things that he believed in and talked about and said, he was right. But there were these weaknesses about his approach that made it so that none of that mattered. It didn't matter how right he was. And that was something he could never understand. And Nicholas even tried explaining this to him. And he could never seem to admit when he was making a mistake. And that's the other thing about him, is he was just a very arrogant man. And he always felt that he was perfectly in control of everything, perfectly in control of his life. You know, he wrote to his mother when he was in prison that whoever it was, they were trying to put out this story that Mosley was suffering psychologically in prison. And he wrote this big long thing to his mother, this letter that's like, oh, it's absolute nonsense that I'm psychologically suffering from my imprisonment. There's absolutely nothing wrong with me psychologically. Psychologically, I'm perfectly fine. Any ailment I have is physical, from physical confinement. That's my problem, not mental. He was always a man who was desperate to project this idea that he was always in control. He was always right, and he always was on the right track, and he was never making a mistake. And that, you know, his political thought never changed very much. And in fairness to him, his political thought never really did change. It's not like he ever went through a radical reevaluation of any of his ideas. It was more just that his ideas developed with new inputs and new inspirations over time. But the title of the first half of the book is Rules of the Game. And it's a great title because it's the main theme of that book. How Mosley, in entering politics, was entering a game with rules. And having to learn the rules of the game is something that politicians all did. But Mosley was kind of someone who always felt like he was exempt from the rules of the game. And it made him an electrifying figure. It made him a figure who people loved and people were inspired by. So many people thought Mosley was amazing when he was in politics, before he became a fascist. And this is a part of the story that's not remembered to this day. You know, people don't remember just how a lot of people thought he was a shoo-in for Labour Party leadership. It was that kind of deal. There was nobody quite like him, nobody who could talk like him. I'm looking for a certain passage. Oh, I don't have, oh yeah, I do have my phone on me. I actually took a picture of this passage because I liked it so much, and I sent it to my friend. So I can actually just pull it up on my phone. And it explains a little bit about this idea of the rules of the game, which is just such a perfect framing device for this book. It's very clever, the way the author wrote it. In all the business about the Mosley Memorandum, concerning both the contents and the reactions of people to it, there was a confusion, barely conscious, not just about the nature of the political game, but about the nature of language, and even about human nature itself. Tom had been brought up outside a political tradition. He believed that politically, words should mean roughly what they said. He had become a socialist because he thought it vital, amongst other things, that the unemployment problem should be solved, that the socialists, when they got power, should try to fulfill their election pledges and give priority to doing this. But then when they achieved power, largely through holding out hopes by their promises, they seemed to be doing nothing serious about the problem at all. Tom was outraged by this. He thought, if you say you want to solve the unemployment problem, then you set up machinery by which the unemployment problem can be solved. If you do not, then this means you do not want to solve the unemployment problem. You should then admit this. Any other attitude is cheating. Those who had been in the Labour Party, or indeed in any political tradition for a long time, knew that in some sense, all this had to be a game. You had good intentions. You honestly professed them in your manifestos. You hoped, by this, to get power. None of this was cheating. But when you did get power, of course, there were often realities which were stronger than the good intentions you had had. You were forced to adapt yourself to realities, not because you were betraying your good intentions, but because if you did not, you might be betraying other good principles more severely. There was often a choice of evils. You had sometimes possibly to do almost nothing. But you could not quite say this. Political language had to be about will, about dynamism, or there would never be hope of improvement. At the back of this, there was a question of how one might see human nature. Tom thought or believed, or wanted to believe, the words are difficult, that human beings are rational. That if human beings are rational, then words should properly mean roughly what they say. There seemed to him no sense in the idea that sometimes a game with words might be properly played, in which the point was that they are not quite believed. But such words are nonetheless valid because this non-belief is recognized by the participants from a higher point of view. In certain areas, human beings play games because the demands on them are too paradoxical to make sense if they do not. In the area, for instance, to do with the necessary exercise of power and the salutary limitation of power, it is not in the simplicities of words that there is truth, but in the recognition that there is something that can be honored beyond words' limitations. Tom's critics in the party, however much they said they believed in the rational processes of socialism, yet believed in their bones, most of them, they had been brought up with less opportunities for self-deception than Tom, that human affairs were for the most part irrational, and there had to be safeguards against the dangerously over-rationalizing tendencies of human beings and of words. When Tom made his proposals for strong central government machinery, they could not attack him directly, because as socialists, this is what they had always been advocating. How else could they have got as far as they had with evolutionary or revolutionary change? But it was by this instinct that they feared the exaggerated implementation of government control. There's nothing more irrational, they knew, than human beings who have been given total power, even to act in such a way as they think is wholly rational. But still, they could not quite say this, or how would they ask for or be given any power at all? Both they and the people who voted for them had to pretend they could be trusted with power. And it was still, in fact, by dealing in limited power that people could strive and hope, sorry, I have to turn the page, bit by bit for reasonable change. But all this only made sense if it was held together by rules of an instinctively accepted political game, rules that were known but not stated on a supra-rational level. So what did such people do when someone came along with rational arguments that did not take into account styles or levels of understanding, who did not see from some metaphysical level what had to be and what was not a game? It was safest, presumably, to ignore such a person, if he could not be properly spoken to. One of the rules of the game was that you could not exactly explain what was and was not a game. If you did, then someone who did not accept that there was a game could simply make you seem a hypocrite. Tom might have understood some of the complexities of games playing if he had pondered more about himself. Of course, he himself played games. His letters to Simi were genuine games. How better could he write to her? It was on his perceiving something like this that there might have been truth. He seemed to have to insist that other people were not playing games. It is difficult to imagine how, in his private life, he succeeded in thinking of this himself, in thinking this of himself. So insights like this pepper this book. Really, really interesting, deep analysis of not just Mosley himself, but the world around Mosley and how Mosley fit into that world and also didn't fit into it. And it's a complex story. It's an interesting story, and it's interesting in the amount of complexity there is. It tells you so much about human nature and about politics So, yeah, this book, I think this has got to be my favorite book of all time now. The one thing that I didn't quite like about it was the personal memoir stuff. I skimmed through a lot of that. I skimmed through Nicholas writing about his experience in World War II. It just, because his dad is so interesting and he's so not interesting. He's such a boring person, but he's good at writing about this really interesting person. And also, there's lots of letters, and I don't think he needed as many letters as there were in this book, because the letters are just tedious and obnoxious. Like, the love letters between Tom and Cynthia, they're just, they're unreadable, a lot of them. And there's so many of them throughout this book, so, you know, you can kind of skip over them because it's not like they really give you much insight anyway that you don't get from the narration. So those are the two things I didn't really like, the two things I skimmed a lot. But other than that, it's an incredible book, and like I said, it's insights like those about the rules of the game. I mean, so how many insights were in that passage? So many, packed together in such an eloquent way. It's like that in every chapter of the book while he's telling this narrative story. So anyway, I'm going to be making videos about fascism in the future. And I'm going to be making videos specifically about British fascism and about Mosley in the future. Now, I don't know how I'll be able to do this, because I have the Italy series going. And I just finished shooting on that first video. And so that's, but it's so slow going that I don't want to wait until that's wrapped up to talk about Italian fascism and then British fascism. So I'm thinking I might end up just doing a separate deal just on British fascism before I end up talking about the Italian stuff. Because, you know, I can't wait to talk about this story. But I don't know what I should do. Because you know, like with the Marilyn Manson stuff, I go through his career chronologically because I feel that I want to understand his artistic evolution chronologically so that I don't miss anything important or miss how one thing led to the next and blah blah blah. There is a utility to handling things chronologically and a utility to going back from the very beginning, which is, you know, the reason why I wanted to start with Italy instead of fascism properly. But and that utility has yielded good results in that Italy video, and you'll see what I mean, how there's so much about the themes of the fascist experiment are expressed in early Italian history in a way that you wouldn't even expect, really. But yeah, it's just that the length of time it takes to do it in that way is not, I'm not satisfied with that. And so I'll need to come up with some sort of workaround, because I'm not totally comfortable with just skipping over Italian fascism and talking about British fascism. But I don't know what I need to do to make that happen. So I'll continue thinking about it. But I definitely want to do my own biography of Mosley. I still have to read Robert Skidelsky's biography, which I've heard is pretty good. He's one of the people who actually wrote one of these reviews on the back. So I still have to read Robert Skidelsky's biography, and I still have to read Mosley's other books, because I've only read his autobiography. I have to read Diana's autobiography as well. So I have to read The Greater Britain and The Alternative and those books. I have read Revolution by Reason by John Strachey. I read that a while back too. So I'm good on that. But yeah, and then I want to do my own biography, and it'll be a video thing, of course, because I don't write literature. I only do videos. But yeah, it's just there's so much to this story, and I think that, like, Mosley will never cease to amaze me. Just the amount of contradictions in his life, in his career, the amount of amazing inspiration, but then also just the strange hang-ups and limitations that he had make him just an endlessly fascinating person. But anyway, that's my review of Rules of the Game and Beyond the Pale. Fantastic book. Definitely check it out.